So yes, I'm John Hammond. I use pronouns he, him. I work for Brighton and Hove LGBT Switchboard, which is a charity that was established in Brighton in 1975. So we're a long-standing, trusted charitable organisation in the city. We are a Biome 4 organisation, and our work stretches increasingly outside of Brighton and Hove across East and West Sussex. We provide services to the LGBTQ plus communities, and our vision is that I guess a world where all LGBTQ plus people can thrive. So we do that through a really diverse range of projects. We have a helpline at our core, and helpline by its nature takes calls often from anonymous callers, and they can be very one-off interactions, or they can be repeat callers, for example, who we might get to know a little bit more over time. We have a social prescribing service for trans, non-binary and intersex communities. We have a domestic abuse support service. We have a health inclusion project. And I manage a suite of projects which we affectionately now call BOLD. And BOLD stands for our bereavement project, our older people's project, so supporting people who are 50 plus, and our dementia support project as well. And so I guess the essence of all of that is that we have many and multiple different interactions with lots of different archetypes of service users, from individual interactions, anonymous, for example, in the case of our helpline, through to long-standing relationships that might be one-to-one. We have peer support offers, which might be group-based. We are also, I guess, as an organisation, in a period of rapid growth at the moment. And so alongside rapid growth comes a greater expectation, I think, that we will be able to assess and evaluate the impact that we have on our people, our volunteers. We have a very strong voluntary workforce, an increasing number of people, and on the beneficiaries of our services as well. So there's a continually greater expectation that we will be able to successfully evaluate our impact. Yeah, I was looking at your slides with a kind of a little smile on my face, because I think we've probably been involved in quite a lot of the phases from very early on, I guess, and that's a kind of key aspect of this community engagement and involvement work, I think. And so we've been a real privileged to be at that place. We've been involved in early discussions about the typical or the preferred kind of outcomes and measures. We've been involved in lots of the consultation stages throughout. We've been involved in consensus building, which you talked about. And we were very fortunate then to be chosen as a test site to kind of trial the prototype for the caveat toolkit, and then be able to give our feedback on, what works well for us, any kind of opportunities for what we saw as development or difference or change. So we've been very fortunate, I think, to have been involved throughout. And I think for us, that's really important, because we, by nature, support minoritized communities. So having that lens, I think, in the mix is very important for any of these toolkits that are developed as well, that they don't just speak to majority populations, that they are accessible, I guess, to more than that. I think there's probably a few reasons. I have a long-standing relationship with the NIHR anyway, from other work that I do, which I think has been really valuable. So I think there's a trusted relationship there with NIHR as an organisation, or as a kind of body, and so that's been important. But also importantly, I think we are continually, I guess, requested now to think creatively and innovatively about how we assess our impact. And that can be really difficult, because you alluded to it, I think, in your presentation as well, about we're a small organisation, and having the time, the skill and resource. We don't have a dedicated, person. We have very fortunate a data and performance manager, but we don't have enough. There's never enough resource, and there's always a challenge, I think, between proving that you do what you do and how you do it versus actually doing it. That's a kind of internal challenge, I think, for charitable organisations. They want to get on with the work. They're there to support our beneficiaries of our services, our people, our volunteers, etc. And finding ways, I guess, to be able to evaluate our work in efficient, effective, meaningful ways is one reason, I think, alongside the trusted relationship with NIHR, to be involved in the project. I think there's lots of different ways. We have a very large and growing voluntary workforce, so the toolkit will help us to consider the benefits, I guess, to volunteering with our organisation, what it might mean for retention and skills development, the experiences, I guess, of our service users. Of course, that's the core of what we do. We pride ourselves on listening to, consulting and responding to the needs of our community members, and I think that's really important that we find ever, I guess, improve, developing creative ways to do that. We will also use the toolkit, I think, to consider a bit more widely about the impact that we're having on our people internally. I think there's a challenge that remains. We might go on to talk a little bit about how our work influences the system more broadly. And I think that remains a difficult kind of area to assess impact, because we know we do, but evidencing that can be really tricky. So some of the other outcomes and measures are actually really helpful for us. The caveat will help us, I think, when we get to that point, I think, of embedding it as a cultural approach, as an organisationally cultural approach, so that it's not one person's responsibility to use caveat, for example, that it's an embedded kind of approach. I think it's also important because our funders, commissioners, demand ever more evidence of impact, and caveat gives us opportunity to explore what that means in reality, I think, for the users of our services and our people, because sometimes commissioners might request a particular measure, validated scale to be used, but that actually says nothing to our community members. And maybe through caveat we can explore alternatives. And sometimes we have to do that too. We have to push back to our commissioners or funders and say that it's not going to be a measure that's going to work for our communities, but we can suggest this as an alternative. And I think caveat kind of maybe prompts us and encourages us to think in that way as well. Yeah, I hope so. I think, anything about impact is an ongoing discussion, isn't it, about how we measure our outcomes, how we assess our impact, how we evidence that. I think needs to be a much more dynamic. It's a tale as old as time, I think, in the voluntary sector about how we do that and how we challenge our funders constructively, because any of the outcomes and measures have to be acceptable to the people who are going to be asked to contribute to those. So some scales, for example, that we've been asked to use in the past are really inappropriate because they can be quite daunting, upsetting, triggering, and we have to respect, I guess, the integrity, the authenticity of our service as well, and its relationships with the users of our kind of organisational projects. So so hopefully that's a very long answer, but I think it will give opportunity for us to explore ever more creatively. And I think I'm excited, I guess, about caveat versions, 2, 3, 4, 5 and beyond. Hopefully this will continue, because I think it can be an ever-evolving toolkit. It's a toolkit. I think that's the thing. It's not an answer to all of our problems, but it's a toolkit that we can use to really help us. I think there's a certain amount of confidence, I guess, that having a toolkit can provide, at least in an organisation. And I know, in smaller organisations, even than ours, there is no dedicated, resource to assessing impact and how you do that. And there's so much expectation from stakeholders, commissioners, funders, for example, that you can do this, but there's no often, limited toolkits, training, opportunities for development to do that. So there's an assumption that you'll just rise to that challenge and be able to do it effectively and then win the next round of funding. But actually, I think that's problematic as an approach. So I think we'll be able to use it in many and varied ways internally as well. I think that was one of the surprises as we were testing and considering Caveat, is that how we might be able to use some of it to assess our volunteer experience, for example, and the benefits of volunteering for us, particularly as we pride ourselves on many of our projects. For example, our helpline is staffed completely by volunteers, so it's really important for us to know the volunteer experience, for example. I think one of the greatest challenges will be assessing impact in a kind of system, I guess, where we don't have influence on external forces. So, for example, the political situation, or the economic situation, or as you briefly spoke in the presentation about COVID, for example. So how we do that in a dynamic way that also considers all of those external forces. We work with minoritized communities who are very influenced by the political climate, for example. And so assessing impact in a kind of wider system and wider environment, I think will be really important for us. That's a challenge, because the toolkit gives us some scope to be able to think about our outcomes and how we'll evaluate this, but it might not do that in the broader sense of what else is going on in the world. And some of those things going on in the world are really important for certain communities. And so I think that will be a challenge for us, is not losing sight of how we do that in a kind of broader context, how we evaluate our outcomes and in the broadest possible context, because otherwise we're losing part of the rich kind of story of our work. And I think also there's a challenge about how we influence the system as a voluntary organisation. All voluntary organisations, I think, are interacting with service users that they might not have done before. They might be holding them for longer periods than they've done before. They might be providing services that they've never done before, because statutory services are so stretched, for example, or the waiting lists are too great, and so I think there's still a challenge, I guess, about our wider impact on the system. And Caveat, might kind of mention some of the highlights about how assessing impact in the system, but that remains, I think, a real challenge for the sector, because I think that's increasingly important. And I think about that from commissioners and funders as well, who want to know, what social value are you having? What is your added value? They want more and more and more from voluntary organisations, and we know, that as a sector, we are doing, exceptional work in very difficult times often. So, yeah, I think that remains a challenge.